History has a habit of presenting itself as calm, orderly, and fully aware of what it is doing. At least, that is how it prefers to be remembered. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. In textbooks, timelines behave politely. Dates line up. Causes produce effects. Conclusions arrive on time. Nothing interrupts the flow. Nothing awkward lingers in the margins. But every so often something slips through. An object, a document, a map, a structure, something real enough to be cataloged, photographed, and briefly discussed, yet strange enough to make everyone clear their throat and move on. Tonight is not about solving those moments. It is about noticing them and letting them remain exactly as uncomfortable as they already are. This series does not argue. It does not accuse. It does not promise revelations, conspiracies, or dramatic corrections to history as you know it. That would require confidence, and confidence, historically speaking, has been responsible for most of our errors. Instead, this series does something far less ambitious and far more unsettling. It records, quietly, patiently, almost politely. These are accounts of discoveries that exist, undeniably, yet refuse to fit comfortably into the official sequence of what came next. Objects that were found, examined, debated for a season, and then placed somewhere safe, by which we usually mean somewhere rarely visited. Museums are excellent at this. So are archives. So are footnotes. An artifact does not need to be fake to disappear. It simply needs to be inconvenient. When something challenges a well-organized timeline, the response is rarely outrage. It is paperwork. A label is adjusted, a paragraph is softened, a phrase like origin uncertain is applied, which sounds scientific but often translates to, we are done with this for now. What follows in this series are not myths, nor are they forgotten because they lack evidence. Quite the opposite. Most were studied carefully, sometimes intensely, before enthusiasm cooled. Scholars published papers. Conferences included cautious panels. Then, slowly, attention drifted elsewhere, back to topics that behaved properly. History, after all, is not allergic to mystery. It is allergic to mess. These discoveries occupy an uncomfortable middle space. They are not rejected outright. That would require effort. They are not embraced either. That would require restructuring assumptions. Instead, they are acknowledged just enough to be ignored responsibly. A map showing coastlines that should not yet be known. A structure built with techniques that arrive too early. A text written in a script no one ordered for that century. A device that functions, but at the wrong moment in time. Nothing explosive, nothing cinematic, just persistent unease. There is something almost endearing about how calmly this happens. No shouting, no dramatic censorship, just the gentle sound of drawers closing. The academic equivalent of saying, that's interesting, and meaning, let's not talk about this again until someone else insists. This series is not here to insist. It does not demand explanations. It does not hunt for lost civilizations, advanced ancestors, or secret global narratives. Those stories are exciting, but excitement tends to wake people up. And this is a late-night history. Here we move slowly. We observe how knowledge is sorted, how curiosity peaks and settles, how certain questions are allowed to remain unanswered. not because they are dangerous, but because they are inconveniently calm. Many of these objects were real enough to interrupt someone's afternoon. An archaeologist paused mid-assumption. A historian frowned at a date. A curator rewrote a display card 3 times. Then life continued. Funding cycles ended. New discoveries arrived. History moved forward, as it always does, leaving a few items politely behind. What makes these finds fascinating is not that they overthrow history, but that they reveal how history protects itself, not with force, but with organization. Timelines are comforting. They reassure us that progress is linear, knowledge accumulates neatly, and mistakes belong firmly in the past. Anomalies do not threaten this belief violently. They threaten it quietly by existing. So consider this opening an invitation not to rethink everything, but to soften your grip on certainty. Tonight and in the chapters that follow, we will encounter things that were found too early, understood too briefly, and then carefully set aside. We will not solve them. We will not rescue them from obscurity. We will simply sit with them for a while, the way historians once did, before deciding it was time to move on. Because sometimes the most revealing part of history is not what we remember, but what we agree, collectively and very calmly, to stop thinking about. The Laventa stone heads. The stone heads do not announce themselves. They do not rise dramatically from cliffs or glow with mythological importance. They simply sit, heavy, quiet, unbothered by the fact that no one has fully agreed on why they exist at all. In the lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, where humidity settles into the ground like a permanent suggestion rather than a temporary condition, the Olmec stone heads wait without explanation. They have been waiting for a very long time. Each head is carved from a single block of basalt. Not small blocks, not manageable blocks, blocks that weigh several tons and originate from volcanic sources, located far from where the heads were eventually placed. This detail alone is usually presented as a technical challenge, which is a polite academic way of saying, we do not know how this happened, but we would like to keep moving. The Olmec culture left no written explanation for these monuments, no inscriptions, no labels, no helpful plaques carved discreetly along the side saying this represents a ruler or please admire our engineering skills. Instead, we are given faces, large, unmistakably human faces, each with distinct features, wide noses, full lips, heavy eyelids, expressions that feel specific rather than symbolic. These are not generic heads. They are portraits. This is where the discomfort begins, because portraits imply individuals. Individuals imply memory, and memory implies intention. Someone was important enough to be carved into stone so massive that moving it alone would have required coordination, planning, and an obedience to logistics that tends not to emerge accidentally. This was not spontaneous art. This was organized effort. What makes the stone heads particularly uncooperative with our expectations is not just their size, but their timing. They belong to an early phase of Olmec civilization, long before the appearance of technologies that modern minds like to lean on for comfort. No metal tools, no evidence of the wheel being used for transport, no draft animals, no written administrative records detailing labor quotas or engineering diagrams. And yet the stone arrived. It was quarried, shaped, transported across difficult terrain, possibly floated along rivers, possibly dragged, possibly rolled using methods that do not survive well in archaeological layers, possibly all of the above, possibly something else entirely. The point is not which method was used. The point is that something worked, repeatedly. Each head required not only the physical movement of stone, but the sustained cooperation of a workforce large enough to justify planning, feeding, organizing, and supervising. This implies leadership. Not mythological leadership, not symbolic leadership. Practical leadership. Someone coordinated this. Someone decided where the head would go. Someone approved the time and resources required to carve a face that did not produce food, shelter, or immediate survival benefits. That alone tells us something quietly radical. This society had enough stability to invest in permanence. And permanence is expensive. The faces themselves refuse to resolve into a single interpretation. They do not look divine. They do not look abstract. They look familiar, calm, slightly stern, mildly bored even, the kind of expression one might wear when being immortalized in stone while knowing full well that future generations will argue about it endlessly. Scholars have proposed that these heads represent rulers, warriors, or elite individuals. Others suggest ceremonial significance. Some point to the helmets or headgear carved into the stone, hinting at ball players or ritual attire. All reasonable suggestions, none conclusive, because without writing, intention becomes inference, and inference is a polite form of guessing with footnotes. What complicates matters further is that some of these stone heads were deliberately buried in antiquity, not toppled by disaster, not abandoned due to collapse, intentionally placed beneath the earth. This detail tends to be mentioned briefly, then gently stepped around. Burial implies closure, or protection, or rejection, or respect, or all of them at once. We do not know. The act of burying something this large would have required as much effort as placing it initially, which suggests that whatever meaning these heads held, that meaning changed over time. They were not simply forgotten, they were handled. This is where the silence becomes most unsettling. A society capable of producing such works, altering landscapes, and coordinating labor on this scale left behind no direct explanation of itself. No chronicles, no dates, no official version of events. Just stone faces and the faint outlines of platforms, plazas, and ceremonial centers. What remains is evidence of organization without documentation, complexity without commentary, a reminder that writing is not a prerequisite for intelligence, and absence of explanation is not absence of intention. Modern narratives often like their ancient civilizations to progress neatly. Stone tools lead to metals. Simple villages lead to cities. Writing emerges before complexity becomes uncomfortable. The Olmec stone heads disrupt this sequence quietly. They suggest that sophisticated social systems can exist without leaving the kinds of records we prefer to read. And this is perhaps why they remain unsettling rather than celebrated. They do not fit into a clean developmental arc. They demand respect without explanation. They sit there, massive and patient, having already survived the part of history that insists everything must make sense. There is something almost ironic about how calmly they challenge us. They do not scream mystery. They do not invite mythology. They simply exist, requiring us to accept that large-scale coordination, artistry, and symbolic behavior can emerge and disappear without narrating themselves for our convenience. In museums and textbooks, the stone heads are often described efficiently. Dates are provided, measurements listed, theories summarized. Then the narrative moves on toward cultures with writing, calendars, and clearer administrative footprints. The implication is subtle but persistent. Clarity is progress. But the stoneheads do not seem concerned with clarity. They remind us that history is not obligated to explain itself in stages we find reassuring, that some achievements arrive early, fully formed, and then refuse to leave instructions behind. They are not anomalies in the sense of impossibilities. They are anomalies in the sense of being uncooperative. And perhaps that is their most lasting contribution. They do not ask to be understood. They do not offer clues beyond their own existence. They simply remain heavy and unmistakable, suggesting that long before timelines were neatly drawn, humans were already capable of organizing labor, shaping memory, and deciding that certain faces deserved to last longer than anyone could explain, which is a very inconvenient thing for history to admit. The Vinland Map. The map did not arrive with fanfare. It did not surface during an excavation or emerge dramatically from beneath centuries of dust. It appeared quietly in the middle of the 20th century in a world that already believed it understood the shape of the past. That timing alone made people uneasy. The Vinland Map shows a landmass west of the Atlantic Ocean, labeled calmly, almost casually, as Vinland. Not imagined, not hinted at, drawn, outlined, given space. It looks at first glance like what maps are supposed to look like: restrained, functional, confident, without being theatrical. There are no monsters in the margins, no warnings, no dramatics, just coastlines, names, and the implicit assumption that the mapmaker knew what they were doing. Which is precisely the problem. If the map were authentic, it would suggest that knowledge of lands across the Atlantic existed in medieval Europe earlier and more clearly than the accepted narrative allows. Not as rumor, not as myth, as geography. The parchment itself complicates things further. Scientific analysis has consistently indicated that the parchment is medieval in origin. The skin, the preparation, the aging, all behave exactly as one would expect from a document produced centuries ago. This should have settled matters. Instead, it made them worse. Because the ink does not cooperate. Chemical analysis of the ink has produced results that refuse to line up neatly. Some tests suggest materials consistent with medieval inks. Others point to compounds that appear suspiciously modern. Not dramatically modern, not neon sign obvious, just modern enough to cause prolonged sighs in laboratories. This is where the story slows down, as late-night history prefers it. No one storms out. No one declares victory. Instead, reports are written. Counter-reports follow. Interpretations multiply. Each conclusion arrives with a polite caveat. The map is displayed, the map is debated. The map is cited carefully with increasingly cautious language. Then eventually the map is removed. Not destroyed, not denounced. Simply withdrawn from public view and placed into storage, where unresolved objects tend to rest. The Vinland map joins a long tradition of artifacts that are too real to dismiss and too awkward to celebrate. What makes this episode particularly unsettling is how civilized the disagreement remains. There is no single dramatic turning point where the map is exposed as fraudulent or triumphantly vindicated. Instead, there is exhaustion. Scholars argue about ink composition, degradation processes, contamination, and testing methods. New techniques promise clarity. Old techniques are questioned. Each advance produces slightly more detail and no closure. And so the map exists in a limbo that history officially dislikes, but frequently tolerates. If the map were clearly fake, it would be useful. If it were clearly genuine, it would be revolutionary. Ambiguity, however, is inconvenient. The Vinland map does not shout that history is wrong. It whispers that history may be incomplete. And whispers are far harder to silence without appearing defensive. What often goes unmentioned in summaries is how restrained the map itself is. It does not boast. It does not exaggerate. Vinland is not drawn as a continent-sized revelation. It is simply placed, proportioned, acknowledged. The tone of the map suggests that the existence of such a land was not remarkable to its creator. That calmness is unsettling. Maps are declarations of confidence. They assert that someone believes they know where things are. A medieval map, including Vinland, implies not just knowledge, but acceptance, not discovery, familiarity. Of course, there are explanations that preserve the comfort of established timelines. The map could be a later forgery drawn on older parchment. The ink anomalies could reflect experimentation or contamination. The map could be symbolic rather than literal. All of these explanations are possible. None are fully satisfying. What matters more than which explanation is correct is how quickly the discussion narrows. Once uncertainty becomes persistent, attention drifts. Funding moves elsewhere. The map becomes a reference point rather than a focus. In academic writing, the Vinland map is often mentioned with careful phrasing: controversial, disputed, subject to ongoing debate. These are not conclusions, they are containment strategies. The public, briefly introduced to the map with excitement, is then gently ushered away. Exhibits change. Labels are rewritten. The map returns to controlled conditions, both physically and intellectually. There is something almost soothing about how efficiently this happens. No scandal, no collapse of historical order, just a quiet recalibration of interest. The Vinland map remains real enough to require conservation and obscure enough to avoid resolution. It occupies a space between belief and dismissal that history uses sparingly but effectively. It teaches us something not about medieval navigation but about modern discomfort. We like our pasts to be linear. We prefer discovery to happen on schedule. Knowledge, in our preferred version of history, unfolds progressively, each culture building neatly upon the last. A map that suggests otherwise feels impolite, and so the map waits. It does not demand reclassification. It does not insist on lectures. It sits in storage, preserved carefully, analyzed occasionally, cited cautiously. Its greatest offense is not that it might be wrong, but that it refuses to settle the matter. In late-night terms, the Vinland map is not a ghost story. It is an administrative inconvenience. It reminds us that evidence does not always arrive with instructions, and that certainty is often a luxury rather than a requirement. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about the map is how little drama it actually contains. There are no revelations, only questions that decline to fade. It does not overthrow history. It nudges it slightly, then waits to see if anyone will respond. So far, the response has been polite silence. And in that silence, the map continues to exist, neither proven nor disproven, neither celebrated nor condemned, quietly suggesting that sometimes the past knows more than it is willing to explain, and the present knows less than it is comfortable admitting, which is, in its own calm and deeply inconvenient way, exactly what late-night history tends to leave behind. The Wandjina Cave Paintings. The paintings do not fade the way they should. This is usually the first thing people notice, even before they notice what the figures look like. In the exposed rock shelters of the Kimberley, where heat, rain, wind, insects, and time itself all take their turns at erasing human effort, the Wandjina figures remain. Not untouched, not pristine, but present, calmly so, as if deterioration were a suggestion rather than a rule. The Wandjina are painted as pale, almost luminous human forms. They have large, dark eyes that do not quite meet the viewer's gaze, and no mouths at all. Their heads are often surrounded by halos or headdresses that resemble clouds, lightning, or rain. They are not dynamic. They do not move. They do not gesture. They do not speak. They simply watch. Or perhaps watching is too active a word. The Wandjina feel less like observers and more like fixtures, elements of the landscape that happen to resemble people. They are not posed dramatically. They are not telling stories in panels or sequences. Each figure stands alone, complete and finished, as if there were nothing more to add. What unsettles archaeologists and art historians is not merely the appearance of these figures, but the persistence of their style. For a very long time, far longer than most artistic traditions tolerate, the Wandjina were painted in essentially the same way. The same proportions, the same colors, the same absence of mouths, the same heavy-lidded eyes. Generations passed, techniques changed elsewhere, tools evolved, environments shifted. The Wandjina did not. In most cultures, visual language drifts. Lines become sharper or looser. Symbols are abstracted or embellished. Styles fragment, merge, rebel against themselves. Here, continuity prevailed. Not rigidly enforced through visible rules, but maintained through repetition so consistent it feels intentional in a way that is difficult to measure. The paintings were not meant to be permanent. At least, not in the way stone monuments are meant to be permanent. They were painted on exposed rock surfaces, not sealed caves. They were vulnerable, and yet they endured. Part of this endurance comes from care. The Wandjina images were not abandoned after their creation. They were maintained, repainted, renewed. This act is often described as retouching, which makes it sound cosmetic. In reality, it was a responsibility, a duty. The image was not a finished artifact. It was an ongoing relationship. This too is unsettling to modern historical instincts. We like our ancient art to be frozen, a moment preserved, a snapshot of belief. The Wandjina refused to stay in one moment. They were kept alive through action, not memory, which means what survives is not the original image, but the decision to keep it the same. And that decision was repeated many times. The figures themselves offer little assistance. Their lack of mouths has inspired countless interpretations, many of them imaginative enough to be politely ignored. Some suggest silence, others restraint, some cosmic symbolism. The paintings themselves do not clarify. They do not explain why the mouth is absent, only that its absence mattered enough to preserve. The eyes, by contrast, are unavoidable. They are large, dark, and emphasized, often the most visually dominant feature. Eyes without mouths invert the usual human hierarchy of expression. They see without responding. They witness without commentary. It is a deeply uncomfortable configuration for a modern viewer accustomed to dialogue, explanation, and reassurance. The Wandjina do none of that. What complicates scholarly comfort further is the condition of the paintings relative to their environment. The Kimberley region is not gentle to pigment. Sunlight bleaches, moisture seeps, rock flakes. Microorganisms work patiently, and yet many of the Wandjina figures remain unusually legible, not immune to decay, but resistant to disappearance. Scientific explanations are available, of course. Mineral pigments, rock composition, sheltered placement, repainting cycles, all reasonable, all true to a degree, none entirely satisfying, because preservation alone does not explain stylistic stagnation. Why did the Wandjina not evolve visually, even as the people who maintained them lived through countless changes? Why did innovation express itself elsewhere but not here? The usual answer is tradition, a useful word, a safe word, a word that means this mattered enough not to change. But tradition is not passive. It requires effort. Someone, repeatedly, chose not to alter these figures. Someone noticed deviations and corrected them. That implies authority, or consensus, or both. The paintings do not depict daily life. They do not show hunting scenes or seasonal labor. They do not narrate events. They exist outside of time, and perhaps that was the point. From a late-night perspective, there is something almost bureaucratic about the Wandjina's endurance. They were not reinvented because they did not need to be. Their job description remained stable. The figures are often described as powerful beings associated with rain, weather, and the shaping of the land. But the paintings themselves do not dramatize this power. There are no storms depicted, no action scenes, no visible exertion. Power here is quiet, static, already accomplished. This calmness makes modern viewers restless. We expect ancient art to communicate urgency, danger, survival, ritual intensity. The Wandjina communicate certainty, and certainty, when left unexplained, is deeply unsettling. They do not ask to be interpreted. They do not demand belief. They do not even insist on attention. They remain where they were placed, patient enough to wait out centuries of misunderstanding. When European observers first encountered these paintings, reactions ranged from confusion to discomfort. Attempts were made to categorize them within familiar frameworks. They resisted, not aggressively, simply by not aligning. And so, like many things in this series, the Wandjina were studied, discussed, and then cautiously framed. They became rock art. They became cultural heritage. They became something to preserve without fully understanding. Which is perhaps appropriate. The Wandjina do not belong to a narrative of progress. They do not illustrate development from simplicity to complexity. They demonstrate continuity. And continuity is difficult to integrate into timelines built on change. In late-night terms, these paintings are not mysteries waiting to be solved. They are decisions waiting to be respected. Decisions to keep a form unchanged, to maintain a visual language long after novelty lost its appeal. The figures remain mouthless, as they always were. They offer no explanations, no confessions, no reassurances. They simply endure. And in doing so, they remind us that not all ancient knowledge wanted to be improved upon, and not all history intended to be louder than the land it lived on. The Ubaid lizard figure statues. The figures are small. That is often the first disappointment. After everything else in early history that announces itself through scale, temples, walls, monuments, these statues ask very little of the eye. They fit comfortably in two hands. They do not dominate space. They do not impress by size. They impress by refusing to explain themselves. They come from the Ubaid period of Mesopotamia, roughly the 5th millennium BCE, a time when villages were settling into patterns that would later be labeled early civilization, long before writing arrived to rescue meaning from silence. And silence is exactly what these figures offer. They are clay statuettes shaped like people, but not quite. Their heads are elongated, their eyes slanted and wide, their faces narrow and unfamiliar. Many have incised patterns across their bodies, scale-like markings that suggest reptilian skin rather than human flesh. Some hold infants. This last detail tends to be mentioned quickly, then abandoned, like a thought no one wants to finish. There are no accompanying texts, no inscriptions, no myths recorded centuries later that can be confidently traced back to these objects. There is nothing to translate, nothing to quote, only form. And form, in archaeology, is a dangerous thing to rely on alone. The Ubaid figurines do not resemble later Mesopotamian gods. They do not transition smoothly into Sumerian iconography. The style does not evolve. It stops. It appears, persists for a time, and then disappears without descendants. This is not how we prefer history to behave. We like continuity. We like influence chains. We like to see one idea soften into another. Instead, here we have a visual language that emerges fully formed and then politely exits the stage. The reptilian features have inspired speculation for decades. Most of it is wisely restrained. Some of it is not. Archaeology, to its credit, usually keeps its voice low here. The safest interpretations speak of symbolism. Perhaps the figures represent deities associated with fertility, transformation, or protection. Reptiles, after all, shed their skin. They move between environments. They survive. These are sensible ideas. They are also generic enough to be safely unfalsifiable. The statues themselves remain unmoved by our caution. Their expressions are calm, almost neutral. They do not threaten. They do not plead. They do not emote. They simply exist. Slightly wrong in ways that are hard to articulate without sounding dramatic. The infants are held carefully, not possessively, not ceremonially, simply held. This detail alone complicates any attempt to dismiss the figures as purely abstract or monstrous. Whatever these beings represented, they were not depicted as alien intrusions. They were integrated, familiar enough to be shown in acts of care. This makes modern viewers uncomfortable in a very quiet way. We are used to dividing the past into categories: human and animal, sacred and mundane, symbolic and literal. The Ubaid figures blur these lines without comment. And then there is the matter of disappearance. When Sumerian culture rises in the same region, bringing writing, administrative tablets, monumental architecture, and a pantheon we can name, the reptilian figures are gone. Not transformed, not absorbed, gone. No lizard-headed gods appear in the texts. No transitional forms bridge the gap. It is as if someone quietly closed a door and did not bother to tell the next occupants what had been inside. This absence is often explained as cultural change. Another safe phrase, another useful container. Cultures change. Beliefs shift. Symbols fall out of use. All true, but rarely so cleanly. The Ubaid figurines do not appear to be marginal objects. They were not one-off curiosities. They appear across multiple sites. They were produced with consistency. Someone knew how they were supposed to look, and then, just as consistently, someone stopped making them. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these statues is not their appearance, but how difficult they are to access today. Many of the known examples were excavated early, documented incompletely, and dispersed. Some are held in collections rarely displayed. Others are lost, damaged, or inaccessible due to political realities and the long afterlife of colonial archaeology. This means that the objects themselves are now almost as fragmentary as the culture that produced them. Researchers rely on old photographs, sketches, inconsistent descriptions. The statues resist modern scrutiny not by design, but by circumstance. In late-night terms, this feels almost appropriate. These figures belong to a period that did not prioritize explanation. They come from a world where meaning was enacted, not recorded. The modern desire to decode them may itself be slightly misplaced. There is also something quietly ironic about how these statues are often discussed. They are frequently used as examples of mysterious, prehistoric art, then swiftly contextualized to neutralize discomfort. The reptilian features are emphasized just enough to intrigue, then softened with reassurances. No, this does not mean what you think it means. No, this is not evidence of anything extraordinary. No, please remain calm. The statues once again do not respond. They sit in photographs, in drawers, in footnotes, carrying infants and refusing to tell us why. What they do tell us without speaking is that early societies experimented with identity in ways we do not fully recognize. They were not bound to strict categories. They did not need to clarify whether a figure was human, animal, symbolic, or something in between. They did not anticipate an audience demanding explanations 5,000 years later. The calm confidence of the figures suggests that their makers understood them perfectly well. Meaning was not debated, it was shared. That shared understanding is what we lack. And so the figures unsettle us, not because they are strange, but because they expose the limits of our frameworks. They remind us that writing did not simply record belief. It replaced other ways of knowing that did not require justification. Once texts appear, ambiguity becomes a problem to solve. Before texts, ambiguity could simply exist. The Ubaid lizard figure statues belong to that earlier mode. They were part of a visual conversation that did not survive translation. In a sense, they are not anomalies at all. They are casualties of our dependence on explanation. Their greatest offense is not their form, but their refusal to leave a paper trail. And so they rest where many things in history eventually rest, acknowledged, catalogued, quietly sidelined, too strange to integrate smoothly, too real to dismiss. They remain as small clay reminders that early human imagination was not obligated to resemble ours, and that some chapters of history were never meant to be continued, only lived, which for a late night history is perhaps the most unsettling conclusion of all. The dog figurines. The figures are not subtle. That is usually the first reaction. Anyone encountering a dog figurine for the first time tends to pause, not because it is small or delicate, but because it is unmistakably present. Large eyes, heavy patterns, bodies shaped with intention rather than realism. They do not blend into the background of prehistory. They interrupt it. These figurines come from the Jomon period of Japan, a culture that existed for thousands of years, quietly building one of the longest continuous traditions of pottery in human history. Long before agriculture dominated daily life, the Jomon were already shaping clay with confidence, patience, and remarkable technical skill. And they were making dogue. Dog are small clay figures, usually human-like, though rarely human in a comfortable sense. Their most famous feature is their eyes, large, rounded, often compared to goggles or lenses. The comparison is modern, of course, and therefore immediately suspicious. Still, the eyes demand attention. They dominate the face. They refuse to be ignored. Around these eyes, the bodies are covered in elaborate surface decoration. Lines, ridges, coils, and patterns wrap around torsos and limbs with a consistency that suggests shared rules rather than individual whim. These were not casual objects. Someone taught others how to make them correctly. What unsettles archaeologists is not just the visual impact, but the sheer number of dog figurines. Thousands have been found across a wide geographic area, spanning centuries. This was not a local experiment. This was not an eccentric phase. This was a practice. The figurines show a high degree of stylistic coherence. Proportions repeat, motifs recur. Even as details vary, the overall form remains recognizable. This kind of consistency implies more than decoration. It implies agreement. And yet there is no written explanation. No texts survive from the Jomon period to clarify what dogu were for. No inscriptions label them. No later traditions explain them clearly. As with so many things in this series, we are left with form without commentary. Scholars have suggested that dogu may be linked to ritual, healing, fertility, protection, or symbolic substitution. Some figures appear intentionally broken, which has been interpreted as ritual deactivation or transfer of harm. These explanations are reasonable. They are also incomplete, because none of them explain why the figurines look the way they do. The eyes remain the central problem. They are too emphasized to be accidental, too consistent to be purely aesthetic. They suggest attention, awareness, or perception, qualities that feel oddly forward-facing for objects so old. At the same time, the bodies are often stylized to the point of abstraction. Limbs are thick or truncated. Proportions are exaggerated. This is not anatomical study. This is conceptual representation. And concept, without explanation, makes modern historians uneasy. The Jomon period is often described as complex hunter-gatherer, which is a phrase that sounds helpful while quietly avoiding the full implications. Complexity here does not follow the agricultural narrative that textbooks prefer. There are no early states, no writing, no cities in the usual sense. And yet there is sustained artistry, long-distance exchange, advanced ceramic techniques, and symbolic systems maintained over generations. Dog belong firmly to that world. The clay itself tells part of the story. These figurines were fired with skill. Temperatures were controlled. Forms held their shape. This was not experimental pottery. This was mastery, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why invest so much effort into objects whose meaning we cannot recover? The uncomfortable answer may be that meaning does not require survival to be valid. The dog were not made for us. They were made for people who understood them without explanation. That understanding did not translate across millennia, and the figurines did not care. There is also the matter of access. Many dog figurines are held in museum collections under strict conservation protocols. Some are designated cultural properties, limiting handling, testing, or invasive analysis. This is understandable. These objects are precious, fragile, irreplaceable. It is also limiting. Modern researchers must rely on surface observation, older documentation, and non-destructive methods. The figurines remain, in a very literal sense, partially closed to inquiry. This creates a quiet irony. Objects created without secrecy are now protected by it. In exhibitions, dogs are often presented with careful labels, dates, locations, a short paragraph summarizing possible interpretations. The tone is respectful. The uncertainty is contained. What is rarely acknowledged is how much these figurines resist narrative closure. They do not fit neatly into evolutionary progressions of art. They do not lead directly to later Japanese iconography. They belong to a cultural world that eventually changed, shifted, and moved on, without carrying Doge forward in any recognizable way. Like the Ubaid figures before them, Dogu appear, persist, and then disappear. This disappearance is not dramatic. There is no clear rupture, just gradual absence. Later cultures in the region express symbolism differently. The figurines do not transform, they stop. From a late-night perspective, this is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. We are used to thinking of history as additive. Knowledge accumulates. Techniques improve. Symbols evolve. Dog suggests something else, that entire systems of meaning can be fully functional, deeply shared, and then quietly abandoned, not because they failed, but because they were no longer needed. The figurines themselves do not argue for their importance. They do not signal urgency. They do not demand interpretation. They sit with wide eyes and intricate bodies, patiently waiting for explanations they never required. There is a temptation, especially in popular culture, to project modern anxieties onto them, to treat their unfamiliar features as evidence of something extraordinary. Serious scholarship resists this temptation and rightly so. But even without speculation, the dog remain unsettling. They demonstrate that advanced craftsmanship does not require writing, that symbolic systems can thrive without leaving instructions. That uniformity does not imply central control, but shared understanding. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that prehistoric people were not waiting to become historical. They were already complete. In the quiet hours of the night, the dog figurines ask us to consider a version of the past that does not lead directly to us. A past that developed its own answers, lived with them comfortably, and then let them go. Their eyes remain open. They are not watching us. They are simply unconcerned with whether we ever understand them at all, which, for late-night history, is exactly the kind of presence that lingers longest after the lights are dimmed. The Nazca astronaut geoglyph. The figure is not subtle, but it is also not loud. It does not stretch across kilometers of desert in sweeping lines. It does not form animals in motion or spirals meant to confuse the horizon. Instead, it clings to a hillside, slightly tilted, quietly visible. From a distance it was never supposed to care about. This is the so-called astronaut of the Nazca Lines, a name that says far more about us than it does about the people who made it. The figure depicts a human-like form with an oversized head, large circular eyes, and one arm raised as if waving or signaling. The body is simplified, almost schematic. It looks less like a person walking through the world and more like a symbol, paused mid-gesture. Unlike most Nazca geoglyphs, which are etched onto flat desert plains and only fully appreciated from above, this figure is carved into a slope. It can be seen from the surrounding valleys, from nearby hills, from angles that do not require flight, which immediately complicates the usual explanations. The Nazca culture is often admired for its precision and scale. The lines, after all, are vast. Animals stretch across the earth. Straight lines extend beyond visibility. They suggest planning, coordination, and a calm confidence in geometry. The hillside figure does something different. It seems almost accommodating. Its placement implies an audience that stands below or across from it, not one hovering in the sky. And yet the figure's proportions and clarity also make it remarkably legible from above. It satisfies both perspectives without committing fully to either. This ambiguity has been inconvenient. There is no confirmed explanation for the figure's purpose. It is not clearly ceremonial. It is not obviously navigational. It does not align cleanly with known astronomical markers. It exists, it persists, and it refuses to declare why. The name astronaut is, of course, modern. It is a product of visual association rather than evidence. Large eyes plus a helmet-like head shape equals familiarity to a 20th century imagination. The figure never asked for this comparison. It simply tolerated it. Serious scholarship avoids the label when possible, preferring neutral descriptions. Human figure. Anthropomorphic geoglyph. Hillside glyph. These are safer words, quieter words. Words that keep speculation under control. And yet the nickname persists because the figure does look different. Most Nazca geoglyphs depict animals, plants, or abstract shapes. This figure feels isolated, singular, almost attentive. Its raised arm is especially troubling. Gestures imply interaction. It appears to acknowledge something or someone. From a late-night perspective, the unsettling quality does not come from imagining extraordinary explanations. It comes from realizing how little the ordinary ones explain. Why place this figure here? Why carve it into a slope when flat ground was readily available? Why give it such prominent eyes? Why make it so easy to see from multiple vantage points? None of these questions require dramatic answers, but they do require answers we do not have. The Nazca people left no written records explaining their geoglyphs. Their knowledge was enacted, not documented. Rituals were performed, lines were drawn, meaning lived in repetition and participation, not in explanation. This leaves modern researchers in an uncomfortable position. We can measure, we can date, we can map. We cannot ask. The hillside figure has been studied cautiously. Access to the site is controlled, photography is regulated, movement around the area is restricted. This is partly for preservation, partly for safety, and partly to prevent the kind of attention that simplifies complex heritage into spectacle. Still, the restrictions contribute to the figure's aura of distance. It is there, but not easily approached, visible, but not casually examined, much like the questions it raises. In publications, the figure is often treated as a curiosity rather than a central subject. It appears in overviews, then quietly recedes behind the more famous lines. Animals are safer, spirals are safer, straight lines are safer. A human figure that looks back at us is less so. The Nazca landscape itself adds to the unease. The desert preserves marks with extraordinary patience. Lines remain for centuries, shapes endure. The environment cooperates with memory, and yet cooperation does not equal clarity. The hillside figure has survived not because it was constantly maintained, but because it was placed correctly. That placement suggests knowledge of erosion, visibility, and time. Someone understood how long it would last. This brings us back to intention. Whatever the figure meant, it was meant to remain visible, not hidden, not secret. Seen. Seen by whom is the question history keeps circling without landing. From below, the figure is approachable. From above, it becomes iconic. It bridges two modes of viewing without explaining why either mattered. Modern narratives often lean too heavily on the aerial perspective because it flatters us. It allows us to imagine ourselves as privileged observers, finally able to see the whole picture. The hillside figure undermines this fantasy by reminding us that not everything was designed for our angle. It was designed for theirs. The Nazca did not need to imagine airplanes to create something that works from the air. They needed only to understand land, distance, and repetition. The figure's effectiveness does not imply advanced technology. It implies advanced familiarity with place. And yet the raised arm remains unresolved. Is it greeting, warning, indicating direction, symbolizing authority, representing a role rather than a being? Each possibility is reasonable. None are provable. The figure does not clarify. It does not evolve. It does not change its pose. It waits. Perhaps this is why it unsettles more than the animals and lines. Those shapes are absorbed into pattern. This one interrupts it. It introduces presence. a presence that feels intentional but not explanatory. In the controlled silence around the site, the figure continues to be discussed carefully. No conclusions, no declarations, only measured language and restrained curiosity. From a late-night perspective, this restraint is telling. The hillside figure has not been forgotten. It has been managed. Acknowledged, preserved, and quietly set aside as something that does not need to be resolved in order to be respected. And maybe that is the lesson it offers. Not every symbol is meant to be decoded. Not every gesture is meant for us. Some were made to be seen, not understood. The Nazca astronaut does not point us toward the stars. It points us toward our own discomfort with unanswered intention. It reminds us that ancient people did not design their world as a puzzle for the future. They designed it to function in the present. The figure remains on its hillside, arm raised, eyes open, doing nothing dramatic. It does not wave us closer. It does not wave us away. It simply continues to exist, calmly interrupting our need for certainty, which, for late-night history, is often the most enduring mark of all. Ecuador's Metal Library. The story does not begin with discovery. It begins with restraint. Deep in the eastern lowlands of Ecuador, beneath dense forest and layered limestone, lies the cave system known as Cueva de los Tallos. For decades, it has occupied a peculiar position in historical discussion, not quite legend, not quite evidence, and never entirely quiet. It is spoken about carefully, usually indirectly, often with a pause. The legend attached to the caves describes something improbable but not extravagant. Vast underground corridors, smooth stone walls, and chambers containing metal plates engraved with symbols. Not treasure exactly, not weapons, records. This detail is important. A library suggests intention without spectacle. It implies storage, order, and patience. It suggests that someone expected information to last. Reports describing the caves emerged gradually, often through second-hand accounts, explorers' notes, and local testimony. The descriptions were oddly consistent. Large passageways, walls that appeared unnaturally smooth, right angles that felt deliberate, and most controversially, metal sheets engraved with symbols no one could read. These accounts did not dominate academic discourse. They hovered at the edges. Interesting but not actionable, intriguing but not verifiable. Then, in 1976, something unusual happened. A large, internationally supported expedition entered the caves. Scientists, speleologists, military personnel. It was thorough, documented, official. When the expedition concluded, the public statement was clear. No evidence of artificial structures or manufactured objects was found. This should have settled the matter. Instead, it complicated it. Because the expedition did not disprove the legend, it merely failed to confirm it. An absence, in historical terms, is a remarkably flexible outcome. The official reports emphasized natural geology. The caves were impressive, extensive, and dangerous, but natural. No artificial walls, no metal plates, no inscriptions. This conclusion was received politely, then quietly set aside by those who noticed what it did not say. The expedition did not claim that the reported features were impossible. It claimed only that they were not observed. And observation, as history has taught us repeatedly, is shaped by access, framing, and expectation. The Cueva de los Tallos is not an easy place to explore. Its passages are vertical and unstable. Its chambers are vast and disorienting. Movement requires caution, planning, and limited time. Even a large expedition cannot see everything. Still, the official conclusion became the dominant reference point. The legend faded into a category reserved for things that are probably not worth pursuing further. Probably. What adds another layer of quiet unease is the present status of the area. Access to the caves is now restricted. This is not unusual. The region holds cultural significance, and indigenous communities have clear and legitimate interests in controlling who enters their land and why. Political realities reinforce these restrictions. The result, however, is that independent verification is no longer possible. No new expeditions, no fresh documentation, no public release of materials that could conclusively resolve the question. The story is not suppressed. It is contained. In late-night history, containment is often more revealing than censorship. If there were conclusive proof of artificial structures, it would eventually surface. If there were conclusive proof of absence, interest would fade entirely. What remains is uncertainty protected by logistics, culture, and time. The idea of metal plates engraved with symbols is especially unsettling, not because it suggests advanced technology, but because it suggests permanence. Metal resists decay better than organic materials. Engraving resists forgetfulness. A society that chose metal for record keeping would be making a statement about longevity, and yet no such society appears clearly in the known archaeological record of the region. This gap is where speculation tends to rush in. Late-night history, however, prefers to slow it down. The reports do not claim impossible alloys. They do not describe machines or power sources. They describe plates, flat surfaces, symbols, things humans have made many times, in many places, for many reasons. The unsettling part is not the technology. It is the silence. No artifacts are available for study. No photographs are publicly verified. No samples exist in museums. The alleged objects, if they ever existed, remain out of reach. This places the story in a rare category, claims that cannot be tested because the testing environment itself has closed. Historians tend to grow uneasy in such spaces. Kiem tra lai ung dung che ngam. Not because something extraordinary must be hiding there, but because nothing can be confirmed either way. In academic writing, the Taos legend is often referenced briefly, then dismissed as unsubstantiated. That dismissal is technically correct. Evidence requires access. Access is restricted. End of discussion. Except discussions rarely end so cleanly. The idea persists because it refuses to collapse under scrutiny. It does not contradict known laws. It does not rely on a single unreliable witness. It simply waits, unsupported but undestroyed. There is something almost administrative about how this story survives. No dramatic whistleblowers. No forbidden documents leaked in the night. Just a lack of resolution. From a late-night perspective, the most revealing element is the expedition itself. A massive effort was made, a clear statement was issued, and yet the legend did not vanish. Because legends built on silence do not require reinforcement. They require only the absence of closure. The Cueva de los Tallos becomes, in this sense, a mirror of how modern history handles uncertainty. When faced with claims that cannot be verified without reopening complicated doors, the solution is often to leave them closed. Respectfully, reasonably, permanently. This does not mean the legend is true. It means it remains unresolved, and unresolved things have a way of lingering. The idea of a metal library beneath the earth is unsettling precisely because it suggests a kind of patience that history rarely attributes to ancient societies outside writing cultures. It suggests information meant to outlast generations, preserved not in fragile memory but in durable material. Whether such a library ever existed is unknown. Whether it could have existed is not the question. The question is why the story refuses to disappear. Perhaps it is because it highlights a blind spot in how we define evidence. Perhaps it reminds us that not all histories surface neatly into daylight. Or perhaps it simply exists as a cautionary tale about certainty. In the end, the caves remain. The restrictions remain. The reports remain inconclusive. No confirmation, no denial. Just a story that sits quietly beneath the surface geographically, intellectually, and institutionally waiting for a moment that may never come. Which, for late-night history, is often where the most uncomfortable chapters prefer to stay. Ancient Vimana carvings. The descriptions arrive already calm. They do not announce invention. They do not celebrate novelty. They simply mention that something exists, and then continue with the story as if flight were a mildly inconvenient detail rather than a revolutionary one. This is often the most unsettling part. In ancient Indian texts and temple carvings across India, references appear to vehicles called vimanas, flying conveyances described with a confidence that feels misplaced to modern readers. They are not introduced with wonder. They are not explained patiently. They are assumed. Some texts describe vimanas as moving through the air, capable of changing direction, hovering, accelerating, and descending vertically. Others include lists of components, materials, and operational instructions rendered in a tone that resembles engineering more than poetry. This tonal mismatch is where discomfort begins, because mythology, when it behaves properly, does not sound technical, yet these descriptions do. Scholars have long debated the age of the texts that mention vimanas. Some are genuinely ancient, embedded within epics whose origins stretch deep into oral tradition. Others appear to be later compositions written centuries afterward, possibly influenced by changing intellectual climates or retrospective imagination. This distinction matters. If the descriptions were purely poetic, their technical flavor would be decorative. If they were instructional, their anachronisms become inconvenient. Technical analyses conducted in modern times have attempted to evaluate the feasibility of the described designs. The results are generally reassuring. According to contemporary engineering standards, the vehicles would not function as written. Materials are implausible, aerodynamics are insufficient, energy sources are undefined or inconsistent, history exhales, and yet something lingers, because even when designs fail practical tests, the conceptual frameworks behind them remain complex. Descriptions include ideas resembling propulsion, control systems, structural stress, and directional stability, not correct by modern metrics, but not random either. This places the Vimana material in an uncomfortable middle space, too structured to dismiss as pure fantasy, too impractical to accept as literal engineering. The carvings add another layer, Across temple complexes, especially those constructed and expanded over long periods, one occasionally finds sculptural elements depicting airborne vehicles, figures within them, or scenes of ascent and descent. They are not consistent enough to define a standard model. They are not numerous enough to dominate iconography. They appear quietly, then recede. These carvings are often explained symbolically. The Vimana becomes a divine chariot, a vehicle of gods, a metaphor for transcendence. These explanations are reasonable, necessary even, but they do not account for detail. Some depictions include structural features, tiers, supports, enclosures that feel architectural rather than metaphorical. They look built, not imagined. What complicates matters further is access. Many temples restrict close examination of interior structures, carvings, and ceiling elements. This is not unusual. Religious sites are living spaces, not laboratories. Preservation, worship, and political sensitivity shape what can be studied and how. The result, however, is that detailed analysis of certain carvings remains limited. Photographs are partial, measurements are incomplete. Context is sometimes inferred rather than observed. This restriction does not imply concealment. It implies priority. And priorities determine what history gets to examine comfortably. The Vimana problem, as it is sometimes called, persists not because evidence is overwhelming, but because it is fragmented. Texts disagree with one another. Dates blur. Carvings resist categorization. No single source insists loudly enough to be decisive. This frustrates modern expectations. We like our ancient technologies either clearly symbolic or clearly functional. Ambiguity feels like a flaw. In reality, ambiguity may simply reflect a different relationship to knowledge. Ancient Indian intellectual traditions did not separate myth, philosophy, and technical understanding as rigidly as modern disciplines do. A description could serve multiple purposes simultaneously: narrative, symbolic, instructional, mnemonic. In such a context, the question, "Did this really fly?" may be slightly misplaced. The more revealing question might be, why describe it this way at all? Why include operational details if flight were purely metaphorical? Why invoke mechanical language if the goal were solely spiritual instruction? One possible answer is that these descriptions reflect speculative thinking rather than documentation, not records of existing machines, but exercises in imagining controlled movement through space, thought experiments rendered as narrative. This explanation is comfortable. It preserves modern assumptions while respecting ancient creativity. It is also conveniently impossible to disprove. What remains unsettling is not the idea of ancient flight, but the discipline with which these ideas were expressed. The texts do not ramble, they categorize, they enumerate, they specify. This suggests an audience capable of following such detail. Whether that audience interpreted the Vimanas literally or symbolically is unknown. The texts do not clarify. They did not anticipate future readers demanding footnotes. Over time, as India's intellectual landscape evolved, later authors revisited earlier material. Some expanded it, some reframed it, some introduced new texts claiming ancient authority. This layered authorship further complicates dating and intent. Modern scholars attempt to untangle these layers using linguistic analysis, historical references, and comparative study. The process is careful, slow, often inconclusive, which is exactly where late-night history prefers to linger. The Vimana descriptions do not force a rewrite of history. They do not demand belief. They sit quietly at the intersection of imagination, engineering language, and cultural continuity. They remind us that ancient societies thought seriously about movement, power, and control, sometimes in ways that resemble modern technical discourse, sometimes in ways that do not. The carvings, restricted and fragmentary, reinforce this impression. They do not scream technology. They do not shout metaphor. They remain suspended between. In public discussions, Vimanas are often treated poorly, either exaggerated into sensational claims or dismissed with equal enthusiasm. Both responses miss the point. The point is not whether ancient people flew. The point is that they imagined flight with structure, confidence, and restraint. They imagined systems. They imagined controls. They imagined consequences. They did not imagine chaos. And that imagination alone is historically significant. In the end, the Vimana material resists closure. It is too complex to trivialize, too impractical to literalize, and too culturally embedded to isolate. It survives because it does not need to be resolved. In the quiet hours, when certainty relaxes its grip, these descriptions reveal something more subtle, that ancient knowledge systems were capable of thinking in layered modes, technical, symbolic, narrative, without needing to separate them cleanly. The Vimanas do not point us toward forgotten machines. They point us toward forgotten ways of thinking, ways that allowed ideas to hover between function and meaning without demanding a landing. And for late-night history, that suspended state, neither grounded nor airborne, is often where the most revealing discomfort quietly waits. The Fojnika Monastery image. The image is small. This detail matters because small images are easy to underestimate. They do not dominate walls. They do not announce controversy. They hide inside manuscripts, surrounded by text, behaving like illustrations that know their place. And yet, this one refuses to stay quiet. The image appears in a medieval manuscript preserved at Fojnika Monastery. At first glance, the scene is familiar: a crucifixion, a composition repeated countless times across medieval Europe. Christ at the center, figures arranged according to convention, sorrow rendered with restraint, symbolism disciplined and legible. Then the eye drifts upward. On either side of the scene above the cross appear two circular forms. Inside each circle is a figure. Not abstract faces, not decorative patterns. Figures. They are enclosed, seated, or positioned. They appear to occupy the circles rather than merely decorate them. This is the moment where viewers usually stop breathing for a second. Official explanations are calm and immediate. These circles represent celestial bodies, the sun and the moon, personified, as they often were in medieval art. This is not an unusual claim. Medieval iconography frequently depicted heavenly bodies as faces, witnesses to sacred events, participants in cosmic order. The explanation is correct. It is also incomplete because the style is strange. Most medieval depictions of the sun and moon follow conventions. Faces emerge from discs. Expressions are symbolic rather than spatial. Bodies, if present at all, are implied, not enclosed. They float. They observe. They do not sit inside something that resembles a vehicle. The figures in the Fojnika image feel contained. They are not emerging from light. They are surrounded by form. This difference is subtle, but it matters. Art historians are trained to notice deviation. This image deviates quietly. The circles have structure. The figures appear to interact with their enclosure. Their positioning suggests interior space rather than surface decoration. The effect is not dramatic. It is simply odd, odd enough to be mentioned, not odd enough to be explained further. The manuscript itself is not publicly displayed. Access is restricted. Scholars must request permission. Photography is limited. This is not unusual. Many medieval manuscripts are fragile, valuable, and protected accordingly. Still, restriction shapes discourse. Most people encounter the image through reproductions, photographs of photographs, cropped scans, contextualized by captions that explain what one is meant to see, and what one is meant to see is already decided. Sun, moon, move on. Late night history pauses here, because the explanation, while plausible, does not address the compositional choice. Why depict celestial bodies this way when other options were readily available and widely used? Medieval artists were not experimental by accident. Deviations usually carried meaning, whether theological, regional, or practical. This image chose a different visual grammar. The figures are not decorative. They appear active, or at least present. They do not dissolve into symbolism as comfortably as expected. This does not mean the image depicts something extraordinary. It means the artist made a choice. Choices are where history becomes uncomfortable. The crucifixion was among the most standardized scenes in Christian art. Deviations were rare and deliberate. Artists worked within strict iconographic frameworks. Innovation occurred cautiously, often under theological supervision, which raises a quiet question. What purpose did this depiction serve? One possibility is regional style. Local workshops sometimes developed distinctive visual habits. Another possibility is theological nuance. The sun and moon could be shown as witnesses enclosed within the ordered cosmos, emphasizing divine control over celestial mechanics. These explanations are reasonable. They are also theoretical. The manuscript offers no commentary, no marginal notes explaining the imagery, no accompanying text clarifying intent. The image stands alone. This is where modern discomfort emerges. We are accustomed to medieval art behaving predictably. When it does not, we want reassurance. We want a label that closes the matter. The Fogenica image resists that closure politely. It does not contradict doctrine. It does not challenge belief. It does not invite reinterpretation of theology. It simply looks different. And difference, when unexplained, has a way of lingering. In scholarly discussions, the image is rarely centered. It is mentioned briefly, then absorbed into broader categories of medieval cosmological symbolism. This is not avoidance, it is efficiency. The field has many priorities. One unusual illustration does not demand extended debate when an acceptable explanation exists. Except acceptable explanations are not always satisfying ones. From a late-night perspective, the most unsettling element is not the image itself, but the reaction to it. The speed with which ambiguity is neutralized. The calm confidence of interpretation. Yes, this is symbolic. Yes, this is conventional enough. No, this does not require further attention. History is very good at this. It does not erase anomalies. It reframes them. The figures in the circles remain. They are not painted over. They are not denied. They are explained just enough to be safely ignored. And perhaps that is appropriate. Not every deviation signals hidden knowledge. Not every unusual image demands reinterpretation. Some simply reveal the boundaries of our categories. The Fojnika image reminds us that medieval artists were not automatons. They interpreted conventions. They adjusted forms. They experimented quietly within constraints. Sometimes the result feels unfamiliar to us, even if it felt perfectly reasonable at the time. The image may represent the sun and moon. It may also reflect a moment when an artist visualized the heavens as structured, enclosed, ordered, more architectural than abstract. This is not a revelation. It is a reminder that symbolism evolves, that conventions shift, that not every choice survives with its rationale intact. The restricted access to the manuscript ensures that the image remains slightly out of reach, both physically and interpretively. It cannot be examined casually. It cannot be overexposed. It remains, like many things in this series, present but controlled. In the quiet of archival spaces, the image waits. It does not ask to be reinterpreted. It does not demand belief or disbelief. It simply occupies a small space in a manuscript, doing what it has always done, being just unusual enough to be noticed, and just familiar enough to be explained away. For late-night history, this balance is revealing. It shows how easily we accept explanations that restore comfort, how quickly we move past things that disturb pattern without breaking it, and how many questions are never asked, not because they are forbidden, but because they are unnecessary. The Fojnika monastery image does not rewrite history. It quietly exposes how history prefers to remain readable, which, in its own calm and unsettling way, may be the most instructive image of all. The Dropa stones. The story begins the way many uncomfortable stories do, without a doorway, no excavation report, no accession number, no museum ledger neatly recording weight, material, and provenance. Just a rumor that refuses to age gracefully. Somewhere in the mountainous borderlands between Tibet and China, according to repeated accounts, a collection of stone discs was discovered. They were circular. They were thin. They had grooves, spiral grooves, cut carefully from the center outward, like the slow handwriting of a patient machine. And then, almost as an afterthought, there were symbols. The discs became known as the Dropa stones, a name that carries no archaeological authority and therefore travels easily. It appears in articles, magazine features, and secondhand retellings. It sounds specific enough to feel credible and vague enough to remain flexible. Descriptions of the discs are strangely consistent. Each one is said to measure roughly the same size. Each bears a central hole. Each contains fine spiral lines etched into the surface, sometimes described as containing microscopic characters. The tone of these descriptions is always careful, not triumphant, not breathless, just certain. And yet certainty is exactly what is missing. There is no official archaeological documentation confirming the discovery. No field notes published in academic journals. No stratigraphic diagrams. No peer-reviewed analysis of the stone material. The discs exist primarily as narrative objects. This is where late-night history grows quiet, because the absence of records does not automatically mean fabrication. It means the usual mechanisms of verification never engaged or disengaged before they began. According to popular accounts, the discs were once displayed briefly, possibly in a museum, possibly as part of a regional collection. Then they vanished. Not dramatically, not stolen under cover of night, simply removed from public view, absorbed into storage, or lost through institutional reshuffling, or so the story goes. Photographs circulate, black and white images showing circular objects with grooves. The quality is rarely excellent. The lighting is always unhelpful. Enough detail to intrigue, not enough to confirm. Written accounts cite researchers whose names are difficult to trace, institutions that no longer respond, reports that were once available. History in this version is always just out of reach. The grooves themselves are the most discussed feature. Spiral patterns are not unusual in ancient art. They appear across cultures, often symbolizing cycles, movement, or continuity. But these grooves are described as precise, uniform, and technical, less decorative, more deliberate. Some accounts suggest the grooves contain a form of writing. Others claim they are records, inscriptions, or encoded information. No one provides a reliable transcription. This is not because translation failed. It is because access never happened. The Dropa stones, if they ever existed as described, have never been available for sustained independent study. They have never sat under microscopes in multiple laboratories. They have never been measured by competing teams. In academic terms, they do not exist. And yet the story does. It persists through repetition rather than evidence, through retelling rather than replication. This makes it deeply uncomfortable for historians, because history is trained to engage with objects, not rumors. When an object cannot be examined, the discipline looks away. But the Dropa stones refuse to disappear entirely. They occupy a peculiar niche, too specific to be dismissed as pure myth, too undocumented to be accepted as artifact. They linger in a state of permanent probation. What complicates the story further is geography. The region where the stones are said to have been found is remote, politically sensitive, and historically difficult to access. Expeditions are rare, research permissions are layered. Archives are not always transparent. This does not imply concealment. It implies complexity. And complexity is fertile ground for unresolved narratives. The Dropa stones are often framed as evidence of something extraordinary. Late-night history resists that framing, not because it is impossible, but because it is unnecessary. The unsettling aspect of the story is not what the stones might mean. It is how easily a story can persist without physical anchoring. We like to believe that archaeology is immune to rumor, that evidence filters truth reliably, but archaeology relies on access, and access is not evenly distributed. There is also the matter of time. Many of the accounts about the Dropa stones emerged during the mid-20th century, a period when reporting standards varied widely, political narratives interfered with scholarship, and sensationalism traveled faster than verification. Some of the names attached to the story are difficult to confirm. Some publications no longer exist. This does not make the story false. It makes it historically unstable. In late-night terms, instability is revealing. The Dropa stones do not challenge established chronologies. They do not demand reinterpretation of ancient technology. They challenge documentation itself. They ask a quiet question. What happens to history when objects fail to enter the archive? Not because they are forbidden, but because they slip through administrative cracks. If the discs were real, their disappearance would not be unprecedented. Countless artifacts have been lost, misplaced, reclassified, or destroyed due to war, neglect, or institutional collapse. If they were not real, their persistence reveals something equally interesting. our tolerance for unresolved specificity. The story survives because it offers just enough detail to feel anchored. Measurements, materials, locations. Enough to imagine, but not enough to verify. From a late-night perspective, this is not failure. It is function. The Dropa stones operate as a boundary object, a story that marks where evidence ends and narrative begins. They remind us that not all historical claims collapse cleanly into truth or fiction. Some simply remain unfiled. In modern discussions, the Dropa stones are often dismissed quickly. No evidence, the response goes. No official record. The conversation ends. Except it doesn't. Because the stones were never disproven, they were never tested. They were simply not found. And history is not particularly good at dealing with missing things. The official record prefers presence. Artifacts that can be weighed, dated, labeled, and shelved. The Dropa stones offer none of that. They exist only as repetition. In that sense, they resemble many things in this series, not anomalies that demand belief, but absences that expose process. They show us how much of history depends not on discovery, but on custody, on who holds the object, who records it, who decides it matters. The stones, if they ever existed, may now be gone, or they may sit in a drawer, mislabeled, uninterpreted, or they may never have existed at all. Late-night history does not choose among these options. Instead, it notices how calmly the story continues without resolution. The Dropa stones do not disrupt history. They irritate it. They remind us that knowledge is not only about what we find, but about what survives attention. And sometimes what survives is not the object itself, but the uncomfortable space it leaves behind. In that space, the Dropa stones remain, spiraled, undocumented, unresolved, doing the quietest thing a historical claim can do, refusing to either prove itself or disappear. The Nampa figurine. The story ends the way many historical discomforts prefer to end, without ceremony, without correction, and without the object itself. There is no final exhibit, no restored artifact placed under glass. There is only a report, a memory, and a gap that never quite closes. In 1889, during the drilling of a well near Nampa, workers reportedly brought up a small clay figurine. It was human-shaped, simple, unremarkable in craftsmanship, the kind of object that would normally be cataloged, dated, and quietly contextualized. Except for one problem. According to the account, the figurine emerged from a depth that placed it within geological layers far older than any accepted timeline for human presence. Not slightly older, not debatably older, absurdly older. The depth suggested an age that predated known human history by orders of magnitude. The implication was not subtle. It was also immediately inconvenient. The figurine became known as the Nampa figurine, not because it demanded recognition, but because it required a name in order to be discussed at all. Reports circulated, descriptions were recorded. A few illustrations were made. Then the object disappeared. Not destroyed, not dramatically stolen, simply lost. And loss, in this context, is decisive. Without the object, there could be no further testing. No stratigraphic confirmation, no material analysis, no replication. The case closed itself by default. This is why the Nampa figurine is often cited as a classic example of an out-of-place artifact, an object that appears to exist where it should not according to established frameworks, an object that cannot be re-examined because it no longer exists in accessible form. From a procedural standpoint, this is tidy. No object, no problem. From a historical standpoint, it is deeply unsettling. The initial reports did not claim extraordinary technology. The figurine was not advanced. It was not intricate. It was not impressive. Its only crime was location. Had it been found on the surface, it would have been dismissed as a recent intrusion or a discarded curiosity. Had it been found in a known archaeological context, it would have been dated and absorbed. But it emerged during drilling, an activity that collapses layers without ceremony and invites ambiguity without apology. The drill does not preserve context politely. It mixes, disturbs, and confuses, which makes it an unreliable witness. And yet, the report exists. Geologists at the time raised objections. Contamination was proposed. A recent object could have fallen into the borehole. Drilling debris could have been misinterpreted. All reasonable explanations, all sufficient to restore order. What no one could do was prove them definitively, because the figurine was gone. The loss of the object transformed the case from an empirical problem into a narrative one, and narratives are easier to manage. The Nampa figurine entered textbooks not as evidence but as caution, a reminder of why context matters, a footnote warning against drawing conclusions from uncontrolled discoveries. In other words, it became useful by being neutralized. Late-night history pauses here, not to revive the claim, but to notice the process. The figurine did not force a rewrite of human history. It did not spark sustained controversy. It faded. And fading is often more revealing than rejection. Throughout this series, we have encountered objects that were studied briefly, debated cautiously, and then set aside. Maps that were withdrawn. Paintings that were explained away. Statues that lost their audience. The Nampa figurine completes the pattern. It represents the final stage. Disappearance. Once an object cannot be examined, it becomes untouchable, not because it is forbidden, but because it is unreachable. Scholars move on, frameworks stabilize. The anomaly becomes historical trivia. This does not mean the figurine was genuine. It does not mean it was fraudulent. It means it became irrelevant. And irrelevance is history's most effective filter. The case remains in records. It is occasionally cited. It appears in lists of anomalous finds, but it no longer threatens anything. Because history, when functioning smoothly, does not require certainty everywhere. It requires consensus in enough places to keep moving. The Nampa figurine fell outside that consensus and quietly slipped away. What lingers is not the object, but the reminder that evidence does not exist independently of custody. Objects matter only as long as they can be examined, argued over, and placed within systems of authority. Once they vanish, the systems breathe easier. From a late-night perspective, the most unsettling aspect of the Nampa case is how unremarkable the disappearance feels. There is no outrage, no mystery tour, no secret vault, just absence. And absence, unlike denial, leaves no marks. The figurine does not haunt museums. It does not provoke new expeditions. It rests in a state beyond confirmation and beyond refutation, which is exactly where inconvenient things tend to end up. As a closing chapter, the Nampa figurine does not offer revelation. It offers a pattern in which discoveries briefly interrupt the narrative, are discussed politely and then removed, not always by force, but by time, disinterest, and logistical decay. Some objects are disproven, some are accepted, and some simply disappear. Late-night history does not ask us to rescue them. It asks us to notice that they were once there, that they were recorded, that they entered the archive, however briefly, and that at some point they were allowed to leave it. The Nampa figurine remains an entry without an object, a claim without a specimen, a question without a body. It does not argue, it does not accuse. It merely marks the place where certainty chose not to linger. And as this series closes, that is perhaps the quietest, most unsettling conclusion of all. Not that history is wrong, not that the past hides secrets, but that some things were found, acknowledged, and then calmly permitted to vanish, leaving behind nothing but the faint outline of where they once disturbed the timeline before order resumed and everyone agreed to move on.